I'm David Biespiel. I'm going to read from my memoir, A Place of Exodus, Home, Memory, and Texas. The book tells the story of the rise and fall of my Jewish boyhood in Texas and how I was raised in an extraordinarily large, dense, tight-knit community in Southwest Houston and then kicked out of that community when I was a teenager by my mentor, the rabbi, and went into exile from Texas now for some 40 years. I'm going to read the opening of the book and then another passage a little later about home. I never told anyone this, but for a time I thought I would be a rabbi when I grew up. Not that I thought about it every day, but especially during my teenage years, by which time it was already too late. Not what you'd think of when you imagine the mystique of a deep-down Texas childhood, with the cattle and pump jacks and muggy vastness, pine pollen and red dirt, farm-to-market roads stitching together lonesome towns that get hotter after the sun sets, evangelical radio, Friday night football, Lone Star flags flying over all the gas stations, 80,000 miles of freeways and billboards, boots and belts and 10-gallon hats. But I don't know how else to describe it. Chanting Hebrew prayers inside the magnetism of Texas lore was my open range of obligation, my 254 counties of faith, my book of third and long. Dots and dashes, slashing across the Siddur, the Jewish prayer book, were my hominy and grits, my leaves of trees budding in February, my hot bowls of chili, my Davy Crockett at the Alamo. The silky ink of Genesis and Exodus stained the flat drawl in my mouth, more gentility than twang, so that I felt paltry and sensuous, the verses cutting into the violent weather of my imagination with their multitudes, curved tropes skittering across the pages like a two-step, a deliberate memento and admonition of how human beings behave. Since my first religious experiences were passed through blood, nothing went amiss. Even in the 1970s in Houston, we still weren't so distant from the lesson of Auschwitz that no one cared that Jews were being murdered. Nor were we so distant from my grandfather's shtetl childhood in Ukraine before the First World War, with stories of buying a cow and taking it to the shachet, the butcher trained under Jewish law. Everybody kept kosher in Cherno Ostrov. No such thing not keeping kosher. On Fridays, when it was time to bench lich, to bless the lights, there used to be a man who would go on the streets and holler, "Time to bench lich." Several thousand families gathered in their small homes and lit the Sabbath candles to brighten the way for the Messiah to travel on a glimmering current. With the black prayer book open in my hands, in another era, in another part of the world when I was a boy in Texas, I too was swept away by a strong current without knowing where it was taking me. Each word quickening, like a dancer who refuses to slip away unnoticed, a folk dance performed over and over without rest in the face of all obstacles. None of that required getting used to. I was an heir to it. Hebrew was a home that had been bequeathed. It came as naturally to my body as fingers and toes. It would have been weird not to be Jewish where I lived in Texas, nor to hear someone announce he was renouncing Judaism, quitting Judaism with no intention to practice Judaism in the future. With all this, there was something frightening about it, of disaster to come, like a portent of thunderclouds over the lowlands. I suppose, when I thought of becoming a rabbi, what I wanted was to give myself a life of enduring myths, and I must have thought to live as a person of faith would purify my principles. I became a writer instead. No great leap. And here I'm going to read a part late in the book. One of the stories the book tells is my returning to Texas to see this particular section of the city after three 500-year floods was destroying this neighborhood, including Hurricane Harvey, which is the biggest flood in Texas history. The neighborhood that I grew up in has the largest conservative congregation in North America in it. That's where I went to school. And then a few miles down the road, just a couple of miles, is the oldest congregation in Texas history. And then across the street from that is a Jewish community center about the size of a Dodger Stadium. And my family lived in the middle. When it comes to what you think of as your true home, I suppose childhood is one's proof of citizenship. The thing about entering the past all alone is it expects you to know more about it than it does. The past trusts you've thought deeply about the rhythms of what has happened to you. The sagacity of memory is that it's always nearby to offer direction and disposition, caution and counsel, cure and comfort, and rebuke. What was I thinking I would find when I walked around these long streets and pondered how I left Texas as someone wrestling with the choices of growing up in an ethnic group in possession of all that glorious disgust, but all that conformity? It was the natural course of events for me, as an ambitious young man, to deny my birthright and rebel, to emerge as myself, as an individual in America in the 1980s, required destructiveness, self-destructiveness, if that's what you want to call it. After I left Texas in 1982, I had drifted on what I took to be light, sparkling waves of a new secular life. The ceremonies and occasions that had once marked time in my Jewish observance like ports of call on the horizon, I passed by, my mouth filled with an acidic taste. It didn't take much work to forget that this autumn month brought the high holidays, or that spring month brought Passover, and I hadn't noticed at all. Or that each Friday night, by not tending it, I violated the Sabbath. Early on, after I set out from Texas, I determined to make myself solitary. I believed solitude could take me towards an otherwise unattainable experience of reality, whether I was living in the remote hillsides of Vermont or at Ocean Beach in San Francisco. I felt flooded in my strangeness, amputated from everyone else, forging new commonplaces, and tending to the business of my existence in alien rooms. Nearly 40 years passed. I had hardly crossed the border back into Meyerland in all that time. What's more, had hardly wanted to, because I always saw myself as feeling endangered by the insularity of my upbringing, the people, the heritage, and the cause, seeking a new kind of American grist, volunteering for displacement like an insurgent. I overturned my Texas existence. For my life's meaning, I ditched the power of one kind of literature for another, the poetry of Abraham's Hebron and Moses' Mount Horeb and King David's Jerusalem for Walt Whitman's Manhattan and Emily Dickinson's Amherst. My opposition was to myself. All that time I lived apart, as if in seclusion, like I was a hermit on a dirt road in the backcountry. I didn't stay in touch. I didn't reach out. I didn't keep up. I wrote poems. I taught. I walked the dogs. I drank. And for anyone who asked, I characterized myself as retired from Judaism, to indicate not hostility, but an evacuation, removal, withdrawal, a fallback, an ebb. I had to wonder, though, as I walked along the bayou, was coming home for a day, motivated by something else: reconciliation, a hunger for the nod and salute of affirmation, or because of the terrible floods, would I see the place and in its metamorphosis as desirable? Was I now just a threadbare literary man of gratitude for the past? Had my rebellion mellowed? Had I finally reached the end of my one-time future? I looked across the brown waters of the bayou, my old haunt, where I had walked each morning to school, where I used to run away and linger and brood about mystery and destiny, where without any trouble I could name many of the families that once lived in these houses, and where once I wished to become no one. Such a benign, mercurial vision, though also a reassurance, something like a promise of the subconscious and unfolding like a fantasy, something that had long been remote and mysterious to me, happened next. It was a memory of laughter, walking with Shelley Rose outside her house on Limbar Drive. She's 16 years old. In the darkness, she bends over and then straightens to snap her long hair behind her head. It falls in layers around her eyes and cheeks. Her face is flushed, feathery. She's like a pale bird that's just flown down from the clouds. She moves in the tense air to the intimate rhythm required by an impossible memory. And all at once, I understood that whatever I once did here, for better or for worse, was still bound up with her story.